keynote speakers. This is a panel of, I can say it, younger faculty, and they're excited about introducing ethical issues into mathematics. And if that sounds strange to you, by the time they're done here, you're going to be able to explain exactly what that really means and how important it is, if nothing else, to your spouse, to your brother-in-law, to a friend, and certainly to your colleagues. So I'll turn it over to this magnificent team, let them introduce themselves and go at it. Thank you again. Who's first?
I'm going to lead it off.
Okay.
So I'm Erin Griesenauer, and I'm at Eckerd College. And this is our talk about ethical reasoning and why that is an essential component of mathematical modeling, and you should all be including it whenever you teach mathematical modeling. And like Brian said, we've got a pretty large group who's working on this. So I don't know, do you all want to introduce yourselves now, or do you just want to introduce yourself when you get to your first slide?
Just do it now.
Yeah.
I'm Feryal Alayont from Grand Valley State University in West Michigan.
And I'm Korana Burke. I'm from UC Davis.
I'm Jeremy Shaw. I'm from Oregon State University, Cascades campus.
And I'm Rohit Thomas. I'm also from UC Davis.
Awesome. Cool. So that is our group. I wanted to start with a nod to the fact that it is Valentine's Day, and so maybe start with some humor. So this is a model from the textbook Nonlinear Dynamics and Chaos by Stephen Strogatz. And it's a model of two potential lovers that we'll refer to as Romeo and Juliet. We're going to let R of T be Romeo's feelings towards Juliet, and we'll have J of T be Juliet's feelings towards Romeo. And we can model this, with this simple system of equations where each person's level of attraction is depending and changing based on their own feelings and then based on the feelings of the other person towards them. And this behavior, the behavior of the system and the fate of the lovers depends on the values of those parameters, the A, B, C, and D in there. And Strogatz in his textbook gets several examples because this really is an introduction to equilibria and stability. But I thought that two were sort of fun to think about. The first one he called star-crossed lovers. So that's the situation where A and D are both 0. B is positive, so that means that Romeo is responding to Juliet's affection, and as her affection grows, so does his. But C is negative, which is saying that Juliet's, responding to Romeo's attraction to her, but she wants him to be hard to get. So the more attracted he is, the less attracted she is to him. And in this situation, you end up in the cycle of love and hate where they have positive emotions and then they become negative, and then they go positive again, and you just end up circling. You never reach an equilibrium, but and then another alternative, depending on those parameters, that he called cautious lovers. If A and D are negative, which in this case would mean each of them is cautious, so they sort of don't trust their feelings, the stronger their attraction is to the other person, the more they sort of doubt it and pull back. But B and C are positive, which is where they respond positively to the other person's attraction for them. The outcome here depends on the relative pull of those two things. So are their mistrust of their own feelings stronger, or is their reciprocating their lover's feelings stronger? And if A and D are large, so if they're overly cautious, but B and C are smaller, then what you get is an equilibrium where they're both neutral towards each other. So you don't end up with a love story, just mutual, neutrality. And so I wanted to start with this, because it is Valentine's Day, so this is fun. But I think from this, we can see some important things about mathematical modeling, like the importance of using them to tell stories. This changing those parameters changes the stories of this model. and ends up with different interpretations. And certainly one of the things that I want my students to do when I'm teaching them mathematical models is be able to see the story behind them and be able to see the importance of the parameters and how they change, and that changes the outcome. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to end there, and I'm going to leave it over to Rohit, who will give you an outline for the rest of our talk. If I can get my screen. Okay.
Thank you, Erin. So this talk is about ethical reasoning and mathematical modeling. So we should start by defining ethical reasoning, and we'll also give a definition of mathematical modeling. Then we'll talk about why ethical reasoning is an essential part of teaching modeling. We'll share some ideas on how you can get started incorporating the teaching of ethical reasoning into your own courses. And then we'll end with some reflections from us and our students after having included ethical reasoning in our modeling courses. So Jeremy is going to start us off with some definitions.
All right, so we mentioned ethics and ethical reasoning a little bit in the title. So what does all that mean? Ethical reasoning is the practice of making decisions in a way that considers ethical principles and the potential consequences of those decisions. For educators like us, ethical reasoning can be realized in the mathematics classroom by having students analyze an equation or an application problem in which a model is used that will approximate the real world scenario. Instructors can guide students to think about the accuracy of a model and how the outcomes of the model how the outcomes of the model can be used to make predictions, and then the decisions of those predictions can have an effect on the real world. So, sounds like we're asking students to think. Math courses typically have critical thinking as a learning outcome, and since ethical reasoning requires this thinking, to think ethically requires critical thinking, students will meet this learning outcome when asked to do ethical reasoning as part of their classwork. So now that you've heard the phrases ethical reasoning and ethical several times now, let's ask the question that you see there. How is ethical reasoning different from ethics? And so ethics is a set of something, like principles, values, or moral values. And according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, ethics are a set of moral principles, that is a theory or a system of moral values, or the principles of conduct governing an individual or a group, like professional ethics. You know, these different professional organizations have a code of ethics, so that could be like something we're talking about. But if you go back now to the top of the slide and reread the definition of ethical reasoning, we're asking that ethical reasoning is the practice of making decisions in a way that considers ethical principles. So in this, making this distinction, since ethics are a set of moral principles, ethical reasoning requires at least some ethics, but not vice versa. I think of ethics as just a list of things we should adhere to, but ethical reasoning is the process of thinking around those. So as we, in this talk, will advocate for teaching with mathematical modeling with ethical reasoning, we are not advocating teaching general ethics or teaching some code of professional code of standards or teaching morality or etc. Students should still learn ethics, but perhaps not in an undergraduate math course, like maybe some of this stuff may be applied as low as that. And that class is already full with required content. So we will try to convince you later in this talk that incorporating ethical reasoning in your class will not take up additional time in your curriculum, and it will not be time-consuming to prepare for your classes. So next, Korana will continue from here and to discuss mathematical modeling.
So all of you at some point have taught mathematical modeling, probably, hopefully. You are here at Simiode, which means you are very familiar with differential equations and simulating with them. And what we're going to be using in this talk is this definition for mathematical modeling, which is a process of using mathematical tools to understand the behavior of real-world system and make predictions about them. So when we're teaching our students, we give them these nice, quote-unquote, nice models that they can solve easily or less easily in on their own, in homework, in classrooms. But what do we know about all of those models? Well, real world is messy, and the models that we usually give to students are simplified models. So when we are talking about what steps come in the mathematical modeling, what we first do is we observe the real world. And then when we're observing the real world, we are thinking about what kind of questions we can ask about the real world. What are we interested in studying? What are we interested in answering questions about? And that helps us articulate a math problem. And when we have a mathematical problem in front of us, then we can look at it and be like, okay, this is still too hard. Maybe we'll make some additional simplifications, or we can proceed with this math problem and we can do the math. And then after that, when we're doing mathematical modeling, we're evaluating the model. We're looking at the outputs of the model and we're comparing it, hopefully, to the real world. And in that process of iterating and comparing it, we might adjust the mathematical model, we might adjust some parameters, but what is inherent to this whole process is that at every single step, we are making choices. And what we are going to talk about, and what our whole point as a group here, is that every single one of those choices that we are making is involving some ethical reasoning. Because every time we simplify a problem, we throw away a lot of the wealth of complexity, of various intricacies of the real world. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to let my next colleague talk about downsides of removing ethical reasoning.
Korana. So, as Korana mentioned, there are 5 steps of the mathematical modeling process, but when we teach math, we usually focus on the do the math part step in the mathematical modeling, or maybe more broadly, application problems, removing all the contextual setup and reflection to us maybe, but not letting our students work with it. But as Korana mentioned, all of those steps include ethical reasoning, making choices, so that removes the ethical reasoning process from student work. But certainly we need to teach the math. I'm not arguing with that. I'm a mathematician, obviously, and students should know how to do the math. But we argue that the other parts are also as essential, and we need to, and removing them have some downsides. So let's look at some of these. There's 3 that I'm going to talk about. There's many more, but I'm going to focus on 3. So the first one, well, by just focusing on the math part, this teaches mathematical modeling in a very simplified way, grossly misrepresenting the complexities of real-life situations. And you might wonder, like, yeah, okay, but we're mathematicians. Why does that matter? Because we want our students to understand those complexities so that they can be aware of those complexities when they're using these real-life models in real-life situations, or real-life models, mathematical models in real-life situations. If you consider the global financial crisis of 2008, one contributing factor to the crisis was the misunderstanding of the mathematical models used in calculating risk and their limitations, and that led to those models being used in appropriate ways, such as not taking into account extreme market conditions. And another more recent example is the AI algorithms and the bias and hallucinations that appear in these algorithms coming from training data, incomplete, and also biased training data that also feeds back into the system again and becomes more amplified. But people are increasingly relying on these algorithms without taking into account the potential for error and bias coming from this flawed training data. A second downside is that, well, we're training our students for being able to use mathematical modeling or application types of situations in real life. Most of our students are not going to become mathematicians like us or pure mathematicians like us, so they will need to use math in real life. Therefore, we need to train them for the full mathematical modeling process, which, as Korana mentioned, includes ethical reasoning, making decisions at every step. by doing all the assumptions and then the calculations, making decisions ourselves, we're not letting our students do that practice in their mathematical studies. And one last thing is, well, let's just be honest, we are mathematicians, we love math for just the math of it, but most of our students are interested in math as a means towards the goal. Maybe they want to create a mechanical structure and they just need the equations to get this mechanical structure to work. Maybe they are trying to solve a medical dilemma and they are just give me the formula. Well, yes, but they need to understand the context to be able to do that. But also, like, if we bring the context in, we'll make the math more interesting to those students. And one side note, like, relates to the first one. This is in terms of not necessarily students going into applying math in real life, but also thinking about future teachers in our classes. So if we teach math in a very simplified way, here are the models, just apply them, we are training the future generation. Kind of like AI feeding back into the system, we are teaching a flawed mathematical modeling process to our future teachers, then who will eventually teach the same way to their future students. Now, Rohit will talk about the benefits of ethical reasoning and context.
Thank you. So, not only is it bad to remove ethical reasoning, but dually it's good to include ethical reasoning while we teach modeling. And some of the reasons that ethical modeling is good to include are dual to the reasons it's bad to exclude. So, ethical reasoning provides one answer to the classic question that we often hear from students: when am I ever going to use this stuff? In the real world, our students will be doing math in context, like Feryal said, and that context matters. And thinking deeply about that context is important, and students get that. They no longer ask this question, when am I going to use this stuff? This also helps students create a personal connection to what they're learning. When students think about using a mathematical model to make decisions, and then consider who might be affected by those decisions, they feel personally connected to those decisions, and so they're more connected to the math. Ethical reasoning requires creativity and reflection. It's not like solving a pure math problem. There is creativity involved. And as Jeremy mentioned, it's also a great opportunity for critical thinking. Students find ethical reasoning relevant and interesting. That also means because different students come up with different ideas and responses, our job as instructors also becomes more interesting. Even if you use the same problems every semester, you'll get different responses from students and different discussions and conversations every time, which is nice for us. It's not just the same. It doesn't get stale as quickly as it might without ethical reasoning. Next, Jeremy will talk about some related initiatives.
Thanks. So here we have a wall of text, and I know everyone says you shouldn't have a wall of text in a presentation, and there are 2 consecutive slides like this. But the idea is that if you choose to download these slides, you have access to these, and they're all in one spot. So this is not an exhaustive list, and there are others that wouldn't be able to go over and still have time for the rest of this talk. So just keep in mind that others out there deserve recognition for their work. So here are just some of the references I wanted to highlight for you here today. First, the Ethics in Mathematics project at Cambridge. The people at this project at Cambridge have been researching and teaching ethical awareness to mathematicians since 2016. The project was set up for sharing the resources to other mathematicians who wish to teach their classes with the same ideas. They also host conferences and produce publications. Next, ethicalmath.com shows the work of Catherine Buell of Fitchburg State University and Victor Piercy of Ferris State University related to ethical mathematics. And then ethicalreasoning.org, they have similar names, it looks like. So I guess they're doing something similar. That showcases the work by Rochelle Trachtenberg of Georgetown University. She's a statistician working on ethical reasoning since 2009. Now, if you combine the last two bullet points, so 3 of them working together, you get the 3-year NSF-funded project, Framing Mathematics as a Foundation for Ethical STEM, which are run by Catherine, Victor, and Rochelle. Us presenters met each other at a workshop at the MAA headquarters in Washington, D.C. as part of this project. And during brainstorming sessions, among more than just the 5 of us were there, but us coalesced together with similar interests and wants, and we've been working together ever since. There was also the AMS special sessions on ethics in mathematics classroom at JMM 2024, which was organized by Victor and Catherine. So I recommend you check out the JMM program to see who all presented there and what their work was about. Feryal and I were there to present our work, which is related to this. Another such presentation at that session was work by Juliana Burkowski and Kathy Erbs. They presented also at Simeo 2024, so this time last year, they had their own talk, and at MathFest 2024 about ethical reasoning in Calculus 1. At the 2024 Joint Statistical Meetings in Portland, in Oregon, there was the Ethical Reasoning for Statistics in Data Science short course by the Department of Biostatistics at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. And since they don't all fit on one slide, the next slide has a few more for us here, this one here, just to mention. So the Markula Center for Applied Ethics has a website, and their website says that ethics is crucial to every professional field, and the Markula Center for Applied Ethics conducts programs in many disciplines, including business, healthcare and biotech, government, immigration, the internet, journalism and media, K-12 education, leadership, the social sector, and technology. So it's a pretty wide-ranging focus there. RadicalMath.com by Jonathan Ulser is a website that offers curriculum, lesson planning resources, and professional development opportunities for addressing issues of social and racial justice in math classrooms. The site is not currently being updated, which they'll say as soon as you visit the site, but the resources are still made available for people like us to use. There's a special issue of Primus on mathematics for social justice, and an upcoming special issue of Primus of ethics in the mathematics classroom. And we have a paper submitted that was accepted for the last upcoming special session. So certainly there have been other recent publications regarding that. There's also ethicspress.com. They have a wide range of books they've published there, but there are some of them there that relate to statistics and data science in ethics. There's also Jordan Register from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Her research includes work about critical and ethical reasoning in the STEM disciplines, as in math and data science, while also promoting equitable participation and attention to identity. Data for Justice Curriculum is a website that has curriculum for data science with a social justice context. And not to be too self-centered, but there's also our work, which Feryal will be introducing in the next slide about ethical reasoning framework for incorporating ethical reasoning into mathematical modeling problems. So Feryal, take it from here.
Thanks, Jeremy. So as Jeremy mentioned, our work started at the Framing Mathematics as a Foundation for Ethical STEM workshop, and that was almost 2 years ago. We developed a framework for incorporating ethical reasoning back into mathematical modeling problems that we have in our courses. And I want to note that we're using the word framework here not as a pedagogical/theoretical framework describing a system or concept, but rather as a structure that's intended to guide the process. So before we describe the framework, we wanted to mention that why we decided to choose a broad framework versus designing individual activities focused on ethical reasoning. Well, our main principle is that we need our students to practice ethical reasoning regularly to both feel comfortable and confident in applying it in their future lives. Well, for this to happen, the ethical reasoning activities should be course level / content independent. I need them in every, well, okay, maybe not in every course, but because of the way we're doing it, in every course where you have applied mathematics problems, topics that apply to real life. And by using a broad framework, we are creating materials that would fit into multiple courses with diverse content expectations and with diverse level. We basically wanted that flexibility in our materials. But also, as Jeremy mentioned earlier, I think it was Jeremy, who said, yeah, well, we faculty are busy. We want this to be easy. So we wanted our materials to be easy to use. And also, I don't want to say quick to use, but should not require a lot of extra time in the classroom because we have full content. So by using in multiple courses and by making it easy to use, we are creating a routine for our students and also for ourselves. Because if we do a framework which can be applied in any content, in any topic and or course, then we don't have to worry about, does this activity material fit with the rest of the content? Am I doing it in the right place after introducing the right background materials, or am I just good to go? So that was our general goal behind the framework format. Now, let's talk about what this framework is. So our general idea in the framework was a really simple idea. Add ethical reasoning prompts for students to answer to existing mathematical activities or problems. Let's go back to the steps of the mathematical modeling. We have 5 steps, but you can officially group them into 3 parts. The first part is the background and context, which is here's the context, what is the observation I'm making here, what is the problem I'm creating out of that, which we usually do, maybe ourselves if we're creating a problem, or we get it from the textbook, maybe the textbook does it for us. And then there's the mathematical solution of the model, do the math part. And then there's a reflection and maybe the iteration of this process. So the background and context part, and then the reflection part, both include decisions to be made and ethical reasoning, and also some discomfort with real life, which might be good for our students, but we're not letting them do this uncomfortable part ourselves. So what we're proposing is, hey, there's lots of flexibility in those parts. Given a mathematical modeling problem / application problem, we can add prompts to those 2 parts, the beginning and the end, for our students to practice ethical reasoning. And our first example is a differential equations example, because we're in the Semioid conference. And because differential equations allow us to do this in a nice way. And Erin will be talking about how to do that.
Thank you, Feryal. So I wanted to talk about an example of using this framework to modify an existing problem that I've used. I actually used this in a Calculus 2 course, but you could use it early on in a differential equations course also. So it started with a problem related to Newton's law of cooling and heating. So this is the general description. It states that if an object of temperature T is immersed in a medium having constant temperature M, then the rate of change of that temperature is proportional to the difference in the 2 temperatures. And K here is representing that proportionality constant. So this can be applied to a lot of different settings. But for me, the thing that makes me think of Newton's law of heating is when I'm cooking. So I'm going to consider a model, where I'm cooking chicken. And the important fact here is that chicken has to be cooked to an internal temperature of 165 degrees Fahrenheit for it to be safe to eat. So I might have asked my students something like, suppose we're baking chicken in an oven that's set at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. If I know that the chicken starts at 70 degrees Fahrenheit and that after 10 minutes it will have reached a temperature of 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the question for them then would be, how long do I have to bake the chicken for it to be safe to eat? So this was sort of my starting question that I might ask my students about Newton's law of cooling. And what I want to do is think about how I would adapt this, to bring in some more ethical reasoning to get them to think more critically about this context. So questions that I might add about about this question, a good one to always ask is to ask whether or not that model is reliable or how reliable they think it would be. And tied to that, you can start to think about how would you test the accuracy of the model, right? We've certainly made simplifying assumptions. So how would we check and see if it's still making good predictions? I like that question for this one because it's easy to check. Right? If I'm baking a chicken in the oven, I can just pull it out and put a thermometer in to see what its current temperature is. Another question to ask them to get them to start thinking about the background and the setup of the model is to ask them about other quantities that you might want to include in this model to improve its accuracy. So for here, and as an example, I didn't say how much chicken we're baking at this time, but maybe it would be good to include something like the type of chicken or how much chicken we're cooking into this model so that it could make better predictions for different situations. And then it's good, ethical reasoning, part of ethical reasoning is thinking about the people who might be affected and who might use this. So to get them to start thinking about that, you can ask them to name entities who might be interested in this model and what they might be trying to answer. And for this, you can think of a few. If I'm someone writing a recipe for a cookbook, I would want to be able to predict how long I would need to cook the chicken in the oven. And then you can start asking them to think about the potential benefits and the harms from this model. What are we gaining from it and what are we potentially, what harm could come from it? Here, I think there's a trade-off. Anyone who's baked chicken too long knows that it gets dried out. So there's a clear trade-off here between making sure that the chicken is safe to eat and drying it out. So overcooking it. And then, the risks of the two, it's sort of disappointing to have a dried out chicken to eat, but it's better than getting food poisoning from an undercooked chicken. So I've got these benefits and drawbacks to overestimating and underestimating how long it needs to cook. And then one of the ways that I really like to sort of get at that a little bit deeper to get them think about it a little bit more is to say, okay, if you're baking the chicken, how long would you cook it? If you go through this model, I think it takes about 36 minutes is what the model predicts. So ask them, are you going to cook it for 36 minutes or would you maybe add a minute or two just to be safe? And then does it matter who you're cooking for? You're cooking for yourself. Would that be one thing versus cooking for your family where there are more people who are at risk? Or maybe if you're cooking in a situation where you're cooking for people who already have, maybe compromised health. So you're cooking at a hospital. How long would you cook that chicken for versus at like a childcare center? So thinking about different contexts and how the risk would be changed in those. And then always thinking back to, well, how could I modify the model to do a better job? So maybe they don't have to do that, but to start thinking about what could I do to change it? Okay, so that is an example that I've used in my class. And now I'm going to hand it over to Feryal, who's going to talk about some examples she's used in her classes.
I think this one is Rohit, actually.
Oh, sorry.
Yes. So here's an example of a system of differential equations in economics. This happens to relate wage share and employment rate over time. As with any system of differential equations, we can first ask students to find the equilibria, determine their stability, plot trajectories, determine dependence on initial conditions, and so on. But all our students are personally affected by the state of the economy, so it's natural to then ask them, how would wage share and employment rate affect them? Which kind of trajectory would you personally hope to experience? At a deeper level, how would the solutions change if the parameters of the model were estimated incorrectly, and who would that affect, and how? And then we can ask the other usual questions. How would we test the accuracy of the model? Who might be using this model and for what? The point is, just like our previous example, we can add the same kinds of ethical reasoning questions to this system of differential equations problem modeling a real situation. Feryal has another example coming up next, I think.
Yep, sorry, I swapped them around. So our next example is from a dynamical systems, discrete dynamical systems that I just used in my combined differential equations / linear algebra course. And this is similar to Erin's starting differential equations example. Instead of a continuous changing model, we're using a discrete model. It's a predator-prey in this case. And this one is from a linear algebra book, OER linear algebra book that I co-authored with my colleague, Steve Schlicker. So the students have this rabbit and fox population dynamical system, and they're given 2 different initial values, and they're supposed to come up with the long-term behavior of these populations in each case. And instead of adding very specific prompts that change based on the problem, I'm making my situation even simpler. So we do have a list of, I don't know, approximately 30 different prompts that are just generally broad enough that you can add to your problems, but I'm making it even simpler. I have one single prompt that can be added to pretty much every application problem, which reads as follows: consider a real-life context of this problem of your choice. They can keep the original context, they can change it. What hidden assumptions are being made? And I put that hidden in there because after some point I started seeing students using the same assumptions that I was clearly explicitly saying in the problem itself. I didn't want those. I wanted the hidden assumptions that are not being mentioned for them to think about those other real-life considerations. How can we verify the reasonableness of these assumptions? And then list some people, entities that might be affected by these assumptions. I used to list some impacted parties, and that seemed a little too broad enough. So I made it a little bit more clear, and I said people and entities. And I choose the entities because I want people to think about non-people, non-human, or non-organization types of entities as well. And this is, as I mentioned, a problem that I just used in my classes. So I have a student response to this that I'm using with their permission, which says this very long response. I'm not going to read it all, but you can see from, I'm going to give you maybe 20 seconds to look at it, just to skim through it. You don't really need to read it. So the one thing that I want to mention is the student mentioned the multiple assumptions made, which I was very happy about. So this is a student who has done this type of problems before in a Calculus 2 class, and they're taking my differential equations class this semester, and they're really experienced with this process now. They didn't have to. There were a few students who emailed me, asked, what do you mean by this question? And that comes back to at the end with my tips for instructors. But you need to do this in your class first, once or twice, before you give it as an assignment. And sometimes forget that little tip for myself. So the student here listed a bunch of assumptions, listed some really nice ways to verify. Data can be recorded, and then list again some nice number of affected parties. So this is what I'm looking for students to do when they're thinking about these ethical reasoning questions. Okay, I think we do have some time to go through maybe 2 more quick examples, and Jeremy will do the first one.
Yes, it'll be my turn again. So this problem here is shown, which I'll briefly summarize for you. It does not mention any ethical reasoning prompts in it. It's more of the computational traditional questions you might find in a textbook. And textbooks are all over my bookshelf, so I'm sure you might be recognizing the style of the type of question. So let's just briefly go over this here. Suppose there are 3 lakes of equal volume. The volume is V, and they are all interconnected. All the water flows occurs at the same rate between the lakes at a rate R. A shipping accident releases 300,000 kilograms of a chemical pollutant into Lake 1. Assume that each lake is well mixed and none of the pollutant settles out. So you're just going to have a mixing problem between three different containers. So this would be a system of three equations for this here. And so what might you find in a textbook like this? Write down the set of differential equations that describes the system. And then once you have that written down, you can then do things like find the stability of the equilibrium. What happens to the solution as t goes to infinity? Kind of standard fare differential equations kind of questions. So in something like this, when I don't see the ethical reasoning prompt, so let me just throw this out there for you to think about while I'm talking. What kind of prompt could you add, or more than one if you want more than one, to have students reflect on the usefulness of this model? All those prompts that Erin mentioned and then Feryal's prompt, a lot of those can be applied at any question, like Feryal had mentioned. So what can be applied here? So I find I lack creativity when I'm trying to come up with something like this. I see a new problem. Do I have to think about how to rewrite a question that specifically mentions the three lakes, or can I just do the same one prompt over and over again? So I find myself doing what Feryal does, just for the ease of use of it all. So what kind of prompt could you think about? What are, so like the potential ethical reasoning prompts that have been mentioned across all the examples can be applied here. For example, one of the assumptions of this problem that was actually mentioned explicitly is that the three lakes all have equal volume. How reasonable is this as an assumption? So maybe an instructor can ask students, do you think the model is reliable in its predictions? How could you test its accuracy? And that can follow through from that assumption being reasonable or not. I'm not very good with knowing my lakes surrounding the world. So are there three interconnected lakes of exactly the same volume? I somehow think that's not right, but it could be. I don't know. I haven't looked at every lake everywhere in the world. So going further, we could ask this about the equal volume assumption. If this assumption is not valid for this particular situation, how should the system of differential equations be modified in order to improve the accuracy of the model? And going back a bunch of slides with the basic overview of mathematical modeling, once you have the results, you might want to reiterate and fix your model, updating it with the newest information before you run it down again, so that you're always incorporating the most recent knowledge to have the most accurate model possible. So those are just some thoughts you can maybe add here. And so we have one more example, I believe, after this one.
All right, so I'm gonna keep this one quick, but I'll tell a funny story. Well, not funny, I don't know, interesting story, I guess. This is a problem from structural analysis application in calculus. So this is my own made-up question, and this has the standard prompt at the end. And instead of saying list some parties, I gave specific number, 10 possible parties that might be impacted positively, negatively by these assumptions, because we had earthquakes in Turkey, and then building collapses were part of the reason why the earthquakes had really destructive impact. We lost close to 100,000 people in our estimates. But I gave this problem to students, and one student used a bridge collapsing example, I think, and they were, I don't know, maybe they had not a hindsight, but what's the phrase for it? I don't remember what the phrase for it is now, but some insight into what might happen. They were talking about construction workers working on the bridge, and then the bridge collapsed, because they were thinking about 10 possible parties. They couldn't come up with enough parties with the bridge collapsing. Like one of the parties that they were listed as impacted was the construction workers working on the bridge, and then the bridge collapsed, and the rescue people and all that stuff. And a week after this question was asked in an exam, unfortunately, the Baltimore collapse happened. And I told the students, see, you have to think about all these potential possibilities, because those can really happen in real life. That was a good life lesson for them. And Rohit will now talk about our implementation reflections, because we implemented these in at least one course, each of us, and we have some reflections.
So what we saw from our students Students engaged more with the problems, which included an ethical reasoning component. The ethical reasoning component made the real life context of the problem more authentic. So it's unclear whether students were more responsive to the authenticity of the context or the ethical reasoning itself. But again, the ethical reasoning is what made the context more authentic. So the point is, the ethical reasoning directly or indirectly increased student interest. Most students did indicate that this was the first time they'd ever had ethical reasoning prompts in a math course. That also meant that their analyses improved over time. After the first couple of times that they do this, they no longer need much nudging or brainstorming. This becomes pretty natural for them. We also saw that for students who did this for 2 semesters in a row, students tended to think a lot more about the impacted parties in the second semester. They got much better at it. One thing to note that's not on this slide, one other thing we noticed is that when students share their thoughts with each other in small groups or through a whole class discussion, they get exposed to diverse perspectives. Students' answers to these ethical reasoning prompts are varied and tend to reflect their own backgrounds in a way that their answers to pure math problems often don't. And so having the opportunity for students to share their thoughts with each other gives them exposure to diverse perspectives and diverse backgrounds, which we would argue is good. I believe next, Feryal is going to talk about some tips we have based on our experience.
Yes. As Rohit mentioned, we had some experience and then we have some tips. My first tip is if you're going to use ethical reasoning, you have to assess it, but don't let the assessment be the first time that students see these types of questions. So having group class discussions are the best environment. As Rohit mentioned, you can get to hear these diverse perspectives and students can think in different ways. And next one is if you're going to use ethical reasoning prompts, these work better with realistic or context that students are more familiar with versus made-up scenarios. I had the structural analysis problem, and the bullet whiz problem, which was about projections. And bullet whiz in a game context, even though students were familiar with it, they weren't really thinking about the impacted parties in terms of the game developer or the company selling the game, which are the more realistic impacted parties. They were thinking about the person in the game being impacted. I'm like, that's not really a person, but I guess maybe we can think of it that way. And then the last thing, as Rohit mentioned, students improve their skills over time. So after some practice, you can ask students to do the contextualizing the problems or adding the ethical prompts themselves. Now, Erin will give us a few more information about thinking about ethical reasoning for the.
Thank you, Feryal. So I think, part of the reason that we are encouraging our students to practice this ethical reasoning is to build up their critical thinking skills. And I think that with the emergence of generative AI, this has become of pressing importance. So, all of us have been affected by generative AI, and our students certainly will be shaped by that. But I think with that in mind, it's essential that students become better at critical thinking. And there's actually some research starting to come out that showing the opposite is happening, that students who are relying on generative AI are in fact relying on it for the critical thinking part as well. So they're using fewer critical thinking skills than they used to. So one of the benefits or one of the things that we really feel motivated by is the hope that we can get students to practice critical thinking and use it when they're interacting with AI. When you use AI, you get an output, and we need them to think about that critically and evaluate the response instead of just taking it on face value. So we want to teach them those critical thinking skills. We want them to know how to question models. After all, generative AI is just a mathematical model, so recognizing that and knowing how to interrogate it is really important. We also, think that this is essential because authentic ethical reasoning and authentic critical reasoning is something that AI can't do for our students. AI can help them with the calculations. Computers are better at solving equations than kids are. But when you think about the ethical reasoning that you get from generative AI, it's all looking backwards. It's all building off of what has been said before. It's all derivative, if you allow me a pun. But we want students to be able to do critical thinking in a forward-thinking way, where they're coming up with new ideas and new solutions, so that we can improve and make necessary changes in the future. So we really think that right now it's becoming more and more essential to include this type of reasoning in our classes so that students become more used to it, more used to thinking about the process that generates an output instead of just thinking about the content and the answer that they get at the end. Okay, cool. And I would like to thank a lot of the people who have allowed our work to happen. So we mentioned the work of Catherine, Victor, and Rochelle for organizing the workshop that brought us all together. Certainly we wouldn't have been able to do this work without that. I'd also like to thank the members of that workshop who are listed here for their constructive feedback on our ideas and for continuing discussions on our ideas. And then Feryal is going to end.
Thank you all for attending and paying attention to our talk. And as we mentioned before, we have some materials on this short link folder. It has our slides and the paper that Jeremy mentioned that will appear while the paper before referee feedback, because we can't put the one after the feedback up there due to copyright, but before our first draft of our paper that's going to appear in the Primus special issue on ethical reasoning. And we have some additional materials that we've used in our classes as additional examples of the ethical reasoning prompts. Thank you all.
Thank you very, very much for a very stimulating presentation. One of the troubles